Anyone see Batman? Alfred walked up with a tray of refreshments for the blue astronaut. I'm afraid he's indisposed at the moment, Master Benjamin, but he should be finishing his patrol and be home shortly. Lucy shook her head at the English butler. He would be late to his own meeting. She folded her arms in a huff. He always pulls stuff like this. Emmett, on the other hand, was glancing out at the few hundred master builders who were still in the midst of gathering on the front lawn of Bruce Wayne's mansion. They'd been waiting close to over a half hour, and it was clear to see that more than a few of the visitors were growing impatient. Or was Superman just being heckled by Green Lantern again? Well, either way, nobody was getting any younger, so the special simply shrugged. We'll just have to start without him. With that, the construction worker made his way to the main podium. A few taps on the microphone was all the signal anyone needed to call the weekly builder meeting to order. But just as the crowd quieted down, and before Emmett could even get a word out, a tremendous gust of wind began to kick up, rising in intensity until it was as if he were standing in the middle of a tornado. A few people yelled in surprise, some ducked for cover, but most just pointed towards the sky. Following their gesturing, Emmett looked straight up to discover a large black object blotting out the sun, one that appeared suspiciously like a bat? Oh, well, no wonder. It was the Batplane, and from said crime-fighting vessel, a caped figure leapt out of the cockpit, making a graceful 10-point landing in the middle of the audience. Unikitty cheered at the sight of their superhero friend. Lucy, who was hardly impressed at all, just rolled her eyes. Show off. Her boyfriend gave a wave. Hey Batman, you're here! We were just about to... But the special fell short on words when the Dark Knight slowly rose to his feet. At first, Emmett figured the superhero was just being theatrical. That is, until he woozily walked up to his friends in a very un-Batman-like manner. The construction worker winced at the odd sight. You okay? Batman rubbed his eyes, coughing out a hasty... Fine. You sure? The Not DJ was less than convinced by that answer. The Cape Crusader refused to meet her eyes and blushed. Or was his face flushed to begin with? He cleared his throat. Sorry I'm late. Just got back from a fight with Mr. Freeze. As if to emphasize his point, a shiver went down his spine. Didn't think it'd take so long to break out of a block of ice. Before he could say any more, he was interrupted by a rather loud sneeze. Everyone in the vicinity jumped back, but rather than be mad, Batman merely groaned and fished through his utility belt, whipping out a black tissue and blowing his nose just as loudly. His ex-girlfriend was 2 seconds away from muttering, "Ew," but refrained, only because the sight of the superhero hobbling over to an empty seat was beyond pitiful. As soon as he plopped down, he waved a tired arm. All right, let's get on with it. Emmett and his friends gave each other a sideways glance. Something wasn't right here. But upon giving the agitated crowd a once-over, it was clear they didn't have time to ponder over what had happened to the Dark Knight. They could get answers after the assembly was over with. In that case, the construction worker took his place at the podium again and finally began the meeting properly. He started by thanking Bruce Wayne for the continued use of his house, to which Unikitty quickly assured everyone that the new dog was nearing completion or being rebuilt. Pretty soon, the master builders would be able to hold their meetings there again. Needless to say, Batman was relieved at the news. It was always a pain in the neck to clear away the yard to fit hundreds of people each week, though it was hard to tell just what he was feeling, not through his constant wheezing and sniffling. The unlucky folks seated beside him scooted over a few feet, trying to focus on what the special was telling them. Things carried on normally for the most part, with the usual updates on rebuilding efforts, newly discovered realms, keeping President Business out of trouble, and etc. The only thing keeping it from being typical was the less than comforting sounds of the Cape Crusader bursting into periodic coughing fits, interrupting nearly every speaker. If he noticed more of his comrades shifting exponentially farther from him, he didn't say anything, nor did he care. By meeting's end, he was the sole occupant of the front row. The crowd wasn't shy about being eager to leave, not wanting to hang around the germ-infested superhero anymore. Only Emmett, Lucy, Benny, and Unikitty stayed afterward out of concern for their friend's health. They'd never seen him in such a sorry state before. After the last person headed for home, the Dark Knight slammed the front door of his house, leaning against it for support. Finally! Never thought it would end. By then, the superhero was looking positively green, clutching at his cape like a makeshift blanket and shivering worse than ever. Unikitty's ears drooped with worry.
Batman, you don't look so good.
He was barely able to shrug. We all have our off days. The princess wasn't buying his excuses for a second.
No, I mean, I think you might be sick.
Superheroes don't get sick, the Dark Knight pouted, unaccepting. He didn't intend to sound so cross, but Lucy nonetheless scolded him. Well, sorry for being worried about you. Take a break. What are you, my mom? Batman barreled past the group and stormed away. I told you all I'm fine. If you're all done here, I got work to do. He disappeared around the corner without another word, his billowing cape swirl putting the period on the sentence. Lucy, having witnessed his little tantrums before, back when she was still his long-suffering girlfriend, just sighed and muttered, "Big baby." She barely got the words out when, just a few seconds later, the quartet was startled at the distinct sound of a loud thump. Hastily rounding the bend, all four pairs of eyes widened at the distressing scene before them. Batman, defender of justice and feared enemy of the criminal underworld, had collapsed on the floor. It took a couple minutes, but after getting over the initial shock, Benny quickly found and retrieved Alfred. With the Master Builder's help, the loyal butler shuffled his dazed boss up to his bedroom, a place that surprisingly wasn't as luxurious or decked out as the rest of his mansion, containing only a bed, nightstand, and modest bookshelf. Clearly the guy didn't spend much time in this retreat resting. Well, the Englishman was going to see to it that he did now. Before long, he had his sick charge out of his costume and into a comfortable pair of black pajamas with yellow bats on them. But even while being tucked into bed, Bruce struggled like a whiny toddler. I can't be stuck in bed, Alfred. Crime never takes a holiday. No, but you will, the butler insisted, pulling out a thermometer he had stuck in the billionaire's mouth. The off-the-chart reading made him glare at his charge with fatherly impatience. You can't fight for justice if you don't get better. He then reached over to the nightstand, upon which he had set a silver tray with a kettle and cup. Pouring the steaming liquid for his boss, he spoke in a much gentler tone. Here, have some tea. It'll do you a world of good. Bruce finally settled down and took the cup gratefully. He couldn't argue there. His butler brewed a mean English breakfast, and it was alleviating the growing, burning pain in his throat. What wasn't so comforting was his four friends gathered around at the foot of his bed, trying not to stare at him with worry. Much as the Dark Knight appreciated their concern, it wasn't exactly the coolest thing ever to have a fainting spell in front of one's comrades. No way he was bouncing back from that. Emmett appeared especially awkward. He may have been aware of Batman's huge ego, but nevertheless, a part of him still couldn't help but look up to the Caped Crusader or any of his fellow superheroes. Seeing the poor guy in such a state was a stark reminder that no one was invincible. The Special scratched his head. Wish I could do something to help you. Bruce poured himself a second helping as he shook his head. I've been on Mr. Freeze's trail for days now. He was trying to steal something that might be connected to something bigger. Just can't figure out what. He took a sip of tea before adding, Gotta finish the job. You certainly did a number on your disposition, Alfred had arched an eyebrow. Don't think that I haven't noticed your less than stellar health these past few days. No doubt being turned into a popsicle gave you a full-blown flu. To say that the billionaire looked mortified at being proven wrong would be an understatement. He curled inward, though whether it was because he was cold or embarrassed was anyone's guess. Yeah. You warned me. And now you can't possibly go back out there until you're better. The butler folded his arms, speaking in his best I-told-you-so voice. Bruce was fuming by that point, grumbling something along the lines of, We'll see about that. Benny, however, was more perplexed than anything. Can't you call any other superheroes? We had, 10 of them here just a few hours ago? The billionaire was very quick to answer. Nah, they got their own problems to deal with. He was trying to sound like he didn't want to be a bother, but Lucy knew better. She leaned into her friends and whispered, By that he means he's too embarrassed to ask. If her ex-boyfriend overheard her, he didn't say anything. He was too busy grumbling to himself. Stupid Stark better not find out about this. Never let me hear the end of it. Before he could say any more, however, he was interrupted by a rather long and deep yawn. He knew that being under the weather could tucker a person out, but why did he all of a sudden feel so incredibly drowsy? This was weird. He stared into the empty cup. Say, what kind of tea is this? Chamomile, sir, Alfred answered, mischief in his eye. With a little secret ingredient. Immediately, Bruce's internal alarms went off in suspicion. What? Just then, to the dark night's line of sight, the room had begun to go blurry, his mind becoming increasingly foggy. But even through the haze, he swiveled on his butler in both realization and a hint of betrayal. Oh, no. You didn't. The Englishman casually shrugged. Sorry, sir, but you left me no choice. Perhaps if you weren't so stubborn. His boss appeared ready to strangle him, but the billionaire hadn't even the strength to keep his eyes open. Before losing the fight to stay awake, he just managed to mumble, Alfred, one of these days, I'm gonna... A second later, he fell into the pillows, out cold and fast asleep. The butler chuckled as he pulled the dark covers up to Bruce's chin, making sure he was comfortable. Good night, sir. Emmett stared at the tea kettle. What was in that stuff? Alfred let out a sigh, feeling just a little guilty for the underhanded methods he had to resort to. I figured the master wouldn't rest willingly, so I slipped a few bat sleeping pills in along with the honey. No wonder the Englishman forsake his usual politeness and didn't offer the master builders any, but Lucy thought the nicknames were only used by the superhero and she nearly groaned. Do you have to put the word bat in front of everything? Meanwhile, Benny had his own question that needed answering. Creeping over to Bruce's bedside, he tentatively lifted one of the crime fighter's arms and let it drop, testing to see just how unconscious the guy truly was. When he barely twitched a muscle, the astronaut grew more daring and tapped him repeatedly. Poke, 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 poke. The nut DJ was fairly sure nothing short of an earthquake could awaken her ex-boyfriend, so she had no hesitation in yelling, Benny, leave him alone! Once her friend stopped screwing around, she turned to the butler. How long is he going to be out for? Alfred stole a glance at the softly snoring superhero, trying to estimate. Oh, I'd say about 10 hours or so. Well, at least he'll feel better, Emmett flashed an optimistic smile. I'm sure Gotham City will be okay without him for 10 hours. Way to go and jinx it. No sooner did the words leave his lips, as if on cue, a bright light flashed by the open window. The gang collectively turned to stare into the evening sky, the bat signal framed against the clouds like a neon sign shouting, Help, the town is in trouble, where's our guardian? Lucy glared daggers at her boyfriend. You just had to say it. Alfred, however, was more alarmed than annoyed. Oh dear. His heart dropped to his stomach as he hurried to the nearest phone. Master Bruce's pride will just have to be injured. He scrambled for the address book in the drawer of the nightstand. One by one, he dialed every number listed, which weren't many considering his boss wasn't the greatest social butterfly. After a few agonizing minutes, he finally hung up. Only then did Unikitty ask, Who are you calling? The butler hung his head in dismay. I was attempting to telephone any of the Justice League, but it would appear they are either on patrol or haven't arrived at any of their respective homes yet. He let out a puff of air. I'll have to keep trying. Just as he was about to pick up the phone again, Lucy held up a hand. Hold on a sec. Bruce may have been being a big baby, but maybe he did have a point. What do you mean? The construction worker asked. The action girl began pacing as a sudden thought occurred to her. What do you think's gonna happen if word gets out that Batman's down for the count? When she didn't get an answer, she threw her arms open. The whole city would implode. There'd be a villain free-for-all. Alfred nodded at the logic. You make a valid point. Lucy went on to say, we need to find a way to play things off as normal as possible and not let on that Batman's sick. Okay. Benny raised an eyebrow. But how? That was certainly the question of the day. Her reasoning was sound, but keeping up such an illusion was another matter entirely. There was only one Batman after all. Or was there? The quartet scratched their chins in deep thought, until all pairs of eyes fell on the Caped Crusader's costume draped over a nearby chair. All at once, the Master Builders gave one another a shared, "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" look. Eventually, Unikitty spoke for the group. Well, we've been through worse, and it's only for 10 hours. How hard could it be? Forget it, Gordon. The bat ain't coming. The police chief swiveled on the much bulkier lieutenant. Give the man some time. He'd be lucky that old Mr. Freeze didn't put him on ice for sure. And so what if he did? Bullock was undeterred and glared at the Irishman. We can handle the city without him just fine. O'Hara didn't take kindly to his hometown hero being badmouthed, to which he and Harvey launched into a heated argument over what was best for the citizens' safety. But the stalwart Commissioner Gordon, who was long since used to their bickering, easily tuned them out. He stood close to the edge of the roof of the police station, still as a statue, gazing out across the skyline of Gotham City with a worried frown. While the building's lights made his town very pleasing to the eye, he knew better, for beneath the Art Deco decorum he could feel a storm brewing, a storm that only the Dark Knight could handle. But as he glanced at his watch, he couldn't help the sick gut feeling that Bullock, for all his smack talk, was right. Their superhero should have been there by now. He could only hope that the Cape Crusader was just busy and out there somewhere keeping people safe. With a sigh, he finally gave up on waiting. Shut it down. Chief O'Hara hung his head in defeat. With a depressed huff, he made a move to turn off the signal. All the while, Harvey chomped down on his third donut, a smug grin on his face. See, what I tell ya, could have been out there by now busting crooks. He brushed the crumbs off his jacket. Goes to show you can never rely on weirdos and capes. He was suddenly interrupted by a gravelly voice whispering in his ear, "And relying on those healthy donuts is so much more comforting." The lieutenant let loose an embarrassingly high-pitched squeal of fright and jumped back, whipping his head around to stare into the intimidating face of Batman, who was poised on top of the bat signal like a crouching ninja. How he landed there without making a sound was anyone's guess, and O'Hara frankly didn't care. His eyes lit up with happy surprise. "Faith and begorra! I knew ye'd come!" "Why wouldn't I? Crime never sleeps, and neither does justice." The Dark Knight jumped down to the gathered cops' level, but kept his distance, choosing to stay mostly in the shadows. "Good evening, Commissioner. Sorry I'm late. Traffic was awful." Gordon nodded in relief. "We're just glad you're here. After trying the phone and the signal, I thought we'd have to resort to carrier pigeons." Batman nearly pouted. "I wouldn't bother. They have a habit of using buggy Wi-Fi and internet cafes." He was about to say more when out of the corner of his eye he noticed Bullock giving him a perplexed expression. He returned the odd glare in kind. "Got a problem?" "You get in a fight with a helium tank?" Harvey raised a brow. "What's with your voice?" The Cape Crusader coughed a few times, hastily replying, "Got a sore throat. Won't let that stop me." But the lieutenant seemed unconvinced. He kept staring at him like he knew something was decidedly off but couldn't place what. In response, Batman took hold of his cape and whipped it around like a vampire, covering his face so only his eyes were showing. Said dramatics threw Bullock off enough that the superhero could turn all his attention to the Commissioner-in-Chief. "What's the situation?" Getting down to business, O'Hara dug through his pockets and handed the superhero a series of photos. The Dark Knight carefully examined each snapshot, pictures of busted windows, broken doors, passed-out guards, and strange claw marks on the walls. As he filed away each piece of evidence in his memory, the Irishman explained, "Over half of Gotham's science labs have been broken into, but darn it all if we can't make heads or tails of who the devil and culprit is. The way the wee rascal gets in changes every time." "Capturing Mr. Freeze was our first big break in the case," the Commissioner added in. "I suspected a pattern at first, but nothing was flash frozen at the other break-ins." He scratched his chin and thought, "Whoever or whatever is responsible for this crime spree, something tells me old Victor didn't do it. Or at least he's not the only one." The Cape Crusader gave a solemn nod. "I'll look into it." Bullock rolled his eyes and folded his arms in a huff. "Great, just what we need. More freaks and masks running loose." The superhero had no doubt he was being lumped into that statement, but he didn't much care. He had more important things to do than stand around and argue the effects of vigilantism. As he made his way towards the roof's edge, he replied, "The only place they'll be running is to the nearest jail." He then put his hands on his hips, cape bellowing in the wind as he declared, "Because I'm Batman." Without hesitation, he backflipped off the building. Seconds later, a bat rope shot out, and he gracefully swung away into the depths of Gotham's underbelly. The trio of policemen watched him leave, O'Hara not hiding his awe. "Don't know what we'd do without the lad." "I do," Harvey quipped. "And you can keep it to your doggone self," the chief glared at him. But just then, a sudden thought occurred to the Irishman. "Although, "What is it?" Gordon asked. O'Hara blushed to the commissioner, hoping he didn't sound as crazy as he felt. "I don't be meaning to speak out of turn, but is it just me, or did the Kid Crusader look a tad more curvy to you?" All was fairly quiet as Batman swooped between skyscrapers like the animal of his namesake. It was only when he was a safe distance away from the police station that he came swinging into an unassuming alleyway, landing with the grace of an acrobat. Glancing around once, then twice, it was only when he was certain that he was totally alone that he dared to remove his cowl, to reveal the freckle-faced Lucy underneath. "Yeesh, how does he turn around in this thing?" she muttered to herself, cursing her ex-boyfriend's suit and its limited mobility. As she wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead, she reached around in her utility belt and fished out a bat communicator she left hidden and on speakerphone. "You guys get all that?" Her 3 friends, who were all listening in on her rooftop meeting with the police, all chimed in at once through the walkie-talkie with shouts of "uh-huh" and "yep" and "loud and clear." Benny was especially impressed. "Wow, you really sounded like Batman." "Thanks," the Not DJ smiled at the compliment. "I got pretty nervous for a sec there." Of course, being the Dark Knight's girlfriend at one time and having hung out with him a lot gave her a ton of practice, but she wasn't about to say that, not when she knew Emmett was on the line. She was broken from her thoughts when Unikitty's voice came through. "So what's the big plan?" "The cops said a whole bunch of science labs were being broken into," Lucy recapped, more or less to keep everything straight in her own mind. "So we should probably start checking all the sciencey places around town." "You think there's more than one bad guy?" Emmett pondered. "Maybe," the action girl shrugged, even though she knew her boyfriend couldn't see it. "But watching the city shouldn't be too hard if each of us takes a section. Just be careful. If anything happens, call the rest of us." "You got it!" The unicorn cat had full confidence in her little charade. "And remember, guys," the Not DJ spoke in all seriousness, not wanting this plan to fall apart before it got started, "we have to try our best to sound and act like Batman. Do things the way he would do it." There came a short pause across the line before the construction worker answered, "Wait, am I hearing this right? This sounds a lot like you telling us to follow the instructions." Lucy paled at the realization of what she was implying and jumped to the defensive. "They're not instructions, they're suggestions." "Right," Emmett replied all too teasingly. "Are you sure you're not just telling us this because you and Batman used to be hanging up now?" The Not DJ promptly cut off her boyfriend before storing away the phone with a groan. This was no time for goofing around. The city was in the middle of a crime spree, and it now had 4 very green superheroes to have to hold down the fort until the real costume crime fighter could return. One could only hope that onlookers wouldn't be as judgmental as Lieutenant Bullock was. The first order of business was to secure a reliable transportation. All the parts Lucy needed were easily found in the alleyway she was calling from, and within a minute the master builders assembled herself a snazzy motorcycle not too dissimilar to the one she created on that fateful night when she first met Emmett. The only noticeable difference was the hastily made bat symbol she slapped on the hood. Pulling the mask back over her head, she revved the engine and sped down the street, praying this cockamamie ruse would work. Yet somehow she had a feeling it was going to be a long night. The Pointed Laser Factory had seen its share of unique customers and visitors over the years. However, this was the first time that Gotham PD had ever shown up, and unfortunately they weren't there to buy but to investigate, if the blockade around the loading docks was any indication. Batman's earlier scuffle with Mr. Freeze did more than its fair share of damage, and half a dozen police cars were still hanging around trying to clean up the mess. While buildings could be easily fixed, the same couldn't be said for people, and a handful of poor souls were still flash frozen, rooted to the spot and stuck in horrified positions. The cops had their work cut out for them, but they weren't about to give up, using all manner of torches, electric blankets, and hair dryers to unstick the crystalline statues. But at this rate, they were going to be there all night. The last thing they needed was for something else to go wrong. They also could do without an earthquake? Over 12 pairs of eyes glanced downward as the ground began to inexplicably shake. It started as a low-key vibration, then gradually increased in strength and scope until the entire block around the factory was rumbling with the force of a jackhammer. The confused policemen shouted in alarm, trying in vain to keep their balance and wondering what in the man upstairs' name was going on. One thing that was clear, however, whatever this phenomenon was, it was moving beneath their feet and changing course. Suddenly, large cracks began to appear in the concrete as the street split apart. And then, to the frightened shock of everyone present, a cascade of what appeared to be gigantic plant vines exploded out of the ground. Whipping and slithering like the tentacles of an octopus, the floral appendages let loose in unbridled fury, flipping over cars with little effort. The officers were too stunned at the spectacle to react quick enough, and the monstrous plants managed to wrap their vines around a few unlucky slowpokes, tossing them aside akin to ragdolls. Their victims' screams caused their fellow flatfoots to finally snap to action, and the few remaining policemen whipped out their guns and emptied all their ammunition into the creatures. But it was of barely any consequence. The fearsome flora shook off the attack as if shooing away a pesky fly, which seemed to give the beasts an idea, for their near human-sized leaves split open, revealing ugly sets of sharp teeth and drooling mouths that were poised to devour their attackers. But upon lashing out, the oversized Venus flytraps, rather than eat the outmatched cops, unhinged their jaws and unleashed a thick plume of green smoke. Before any of the policemen could even reach for their radios to call for backup, the nauseous gas filled their lungs, and one by one they fell to the ground, completely unconscious. It was hard to believe the battle lasted less than a minute. But a minute was all a certain red-haired thief needed to slip inside the building, find what she was looking for, and leave. Just as the toxic fog was beginning to fan out, the leaf-covered and sultry form of Poison Ivy came waltzing out of the loading bay, a pointed laser as tall as she was hefted under one arm. She petted one of her creatures with all the pride of a doting mother as she surveyed the destruction. Any last traces of ice were now being covered by vines and basketball-sized flowers. She shook her head at the unfairness of it all and sighed. When will that Mr. Freeze learn that ice is last season? Never send a man to do a woman's job. I hate cleaning up after his mess. And I hate police officers being sprayed in the face and being eaten by plants. Instantly, the villainess turned her head skyward, searching for the source of the voice. Though she was hardly surprised, she still couldn't help her eyes narrowing in contempt at the unwelcoming sight of Batman standing on the opposing rooftop. With his hands on his hips and cape blowing in the wind, he cut an imposing figure who wasn't about to let her get away. Little did the redhead know it was actually a very nervous construction worker behind the mask. He cringed at his less than stellar opening and mumbled to himself, "Gotta work on my heroic dialogue." Having stumbled upon the robbery in progress, Emmett did his best to not let his heart pound at the thought of having to actually fight one of his friend's rogues gallery, but he figured if he could take down micromanagers and a giant robot and face against sea pirates, he could probably handle one lady. Although had he arrived just a minute earlier and witnessed the showdown with the cops and killer plants, he might have been singing a different tune. Batman! Poison Ivy's single cry stirred him to action. Time to put his acting skills to work. The plant-covered femme fatale had hefted the pointed laser on her shoulder. Not exactly her style, but if one had a powerful weapon in hand, it made sense to make use of it. She took aim at her foe and fired. The red beam of energy headed straight for the phony Dark Knight. Thankfully, Emmett was fairly agile, especially when scared, and he dodged the blast in the nick of time, the section of the roof he was standing on now a pile of rubble. But between his fear and the shockwave of the explosion, what was supposed to be a dramatic leap off the building wound up looking like a baby bird trying to fly for the first time. The special flailed his arms, tripping over his own feet as the nearby fire escape broke his fall. He tumbled down the steps on his butt like the world's bumpiest playground slide until he landed on the ground face first. So much for first impressions. Ivy was too busy struggling with the weight of having to heft such a heavy object around that she hardly noticed that Batman's usual finesse wasn't up to par. In the moment she was struggling, the construction worker sprang to his feet, adjusting his mask as he sized up his opponent. The real superhero had to have something in his arsenal to deal with those unfriendly plants. Quickly, he scrambled around in his utility belt in the hopes he'd find a can of bat weed killer. What he found instead was the Cape Crusader's trusty batarang. By then, the villainess had recovered and was prepping to take another pot shot at him. With only a second to react, Emmett threw the weapon as hard as he could, assuming the device would just automatically do what it was supposed to do. He left far too much to wishful thinking. Poison Ivy calmly ducked, and the projectile harmlessly whizzed over his head. However, the curvature of the weapon caused it to turn a wide arc and come sailing back to its sender as per its namesake, and during its return trip, its sharp edges sliced through the mutant vines in quick succession. Like a stack of dominoes, the carnivorous flora fell to the ground, shriveling up and dying instantly. Their deranged mother watched on, horrified, to which even the specials stared in shock at his stroke of luck. I meant to do that. The raging redhead didn't much care whether her enemy meant it or not. He would rue the day he killed her children. Still fuming at the loss of her creature, she abandoned the laser for the time being and produced a bundle of darts seemingly from nowhere. With her tips laced in poison, she whipped the sharp bullets at him in swift succession. While Emmett had no clue about the toxic ingredients, the deadly intent was all the same. In a panic, he covered his face and spun around, but his fear turned out to be an advantage, for in having his back turned, the darts bounced harmlessly off his protective cape. The construction worker couldn't hold back his surprise for a second time and nearly said aloud, "Oh, so that's why superheroes wear capes." He thanked the man upstairs for his good luck. Maybe he could pull this off. Poison Ivy would see to it that he didn't. "You'll pay for that!" She broke into a dead sprint. If weapons wouldn't work, maybe her fists would. The fake vigilante backed up a few steps, reaching into a pocket at random and hoping whatever he fished out would work like the Batarang did. I have no clue what this does, but take this!" The gadget lottery gave him a handful of marbles. The second he tossed them, the pellets let out a crackling sound before exploding into a thick cloud of gray and black smoke. The villainess had no choice but to come to a stop, coughing on the mist and waving her arms to dispel the dust. With her unable to see, the special knew this was his prime chance to do something. He dug around again in his belt's many compartments in an attempt to find a pair of handcuffs. What he came across instead was a small pistol with a harpoon-esque object attached, and all at once his face lit up. His memory flashed back to when he and the real Cape Crusader were fighting the Duplonians, and he distinctly remembered the superhero using this weapon. Finally, a device that he actually knew what it did. "Alright, time to tangle your vines." Emmett mentally cheered at having come up with a catchy line. Without hesitation, he took aim and fired. Unfortunately, he pushed Lady Luck one too many times. Too late did he realize he had the gun pointed the wrong way. A fishing net burst out around him, and the only person he succeeded in capturing was himself. Between the ropes, his cape, and his growing frustration, he collapsed into a tangled heap on the ground, barely able to move. By that time, the smoke screen had dissipated, to which Poison Ivy came sauntering up to the incapacitated superhero wannabe. There was no hiding the slight confusion in her eyes, but her smirk held nothing but wry amusement at this turn of events. She had half a mind to just take full advantage and run while she could. But something about all this was just off, and she intended to find out. "Well, you're in a bit of a bind, aren't you?" Very funny, the special tried to focus solely on freeing himself. "What's really funny is that your little peas in a pod aren't with you." The redhead raised a brow. "Why so lonely, Batsy?" It took a moment for the construction worker to piece together that she was referring to the Dark Knight's sidekicks, Robin and Batgirl. Where they were at in all this commotion was anyone's guess, but he sincerely wished they were there right then. He was beyond in over his head if he believed he could defeat one of Batman's Rose Gallery all by himself. What was he thinking? In answer to her question, all he could say was, "They were tied up." And I thought I was the comedian here. Ivy nearly laughed. She should have just ran or finished her foe right then. But at the moment, she was short on plant minions to assist her, with no way to create any more, and that laser cannon wasn't going to move itself. A much more useful idea came to her as she bent over. "You need to loosen up. Here, let me help you." The second she started getting closer, Emmett tried to back off to no avail. "I can help myself, thanks." "Oh, come now," the femme fatale playfully teased him. "Everyone needs a helping hand now and then. Or two." With that, she opened both of her cupped hands and blew him a gentle kiss, as well as a pink powder in his face. With no way to defend himself, the helpless construction worker coughed on the sweet-smelling perfume. And within a minute, both his eyes and complexion turned a faint green color. And slowly but surely, his struggling came to a halt as he seemed to fall into a trance-like state. Her victim now pacified, the villainess proceeded to cut him out of the cumbersome net, pulling him to his feet and speaking in a soothing tone. There now, since I was so kind as to help you, would you be so kind as to help me? To the special, the question couldn't have sounded more harmonious. He gazed at the plant-covered young lady in a completely foggy bliss, no longer remembering what he was doing or what his mission was. He barely even thought about his own name or his friends any longer. And he hardly cared. All his worries disappeared into the ether. His only desire was his burning love for Poison Ivy and doing anything to please her. He finally cooed in a monotone voice. Yes, mistress. The redhead batted her eyelashes. Oh, thank you. I have a few chores to do, and I could really use a strong, strapping man like you. She traced the circle around the bat emblem on his chest, speaking flirtatiously. It's nothing too difficult. You can follow some simple instructions, can't you? Yes, mistress, the phony Batman smirked. I love following instructions, especially yours. The femme fatale giggled and pinched his cheeks. You're my hero. She then motioned to the pointed laser she dropped nearby. Come now, we have many seeds to sow and so little time. Emmett was all too eager to obey. Yes, mistress. With no further remark, the bat-suited construction worker lifted the heavy weapon with relative ease, trailing behind Poison Ivy like a lovesick puppy. And completely oblivious to the bat communicator buzzing in the pocket of his belt, his forgotten girlfriend's voice chiming through. Emmett? Benny? Guys? Are you there? Anyone? Not counting when he became an astronaut and traveled to the moon for the first time, Benny felt like all his childhood dreams had come true. The astronaut was soaring through the skies above Gotham with the aid of his jetpack, hands swept out in front of him and cape blowing in the wind like a true superhero. Too bad he couldn't keep his blue suit, or else he probably could have passed for Superman, except he was supposed to be Batman. He had traded his marine spacesuit for a black one, using a magic marker to sketch a mask on his helmet visor, and with a little construction paper and scotch tape, he had made a proper bat symbol to hide the planet design on his chest. Not exactly the Ritz, but it would do in a pinch, and since Bruce's clothes didn't fit him right, well, they didn't call Master Builders creative for nothing. The spaceman was just about to bust out whistling some dramatic whoosh noises when just then the distant ringing of an alarm caught his attention. He came to a stop, hovering in the air as he tried to discern where the disturbance was coming from. The moment he got his bearings, he called out, "Uh-oh, sounds like trouble. This looks like a job for Batbenny." With that, the newly minted Crusader for Justice took off like a rocket, doing everything in his power to refrain from humming an epic theme song for himself. As the sounds of the blaring siren grew exponentially louder, he knew he was getting close, and in under a minute, the astronaut arrived at the scene of the crime. It was a massive building that looked akin to a coliseum in design, save for the fancy sign on the street corner that boasted Gotham National Space Museum. What luck! Of all the places for Benny to end up. He made a mental note that he'd have to come back and visit sometime if the gigantic model of the lunar module on the rooftop was any more incentive. But back to business. Benny came to touchdown right outside the museum entrance, and immediately it was clear that something was amiss. Besides the obvious alarms blasting, the main doors were busted wide open for anyone to just stroll inside. Thankfully, anyone could also include heroic vigilantes. Taking the bait, the spaceman dashed into the front welcome center, an area that covered about half the length of a football field. He could just make out the outlines of a number of rockets, displays, and other memorabilia dotted about, though it was difficult to see clearly since the bulk of the lights were off. However, the scene of about 5 security guards all lying on the floor was something the astronaut could see. He jogged over to the nearest victim, patting the man on the back in concern. "Hey, are you okay?" The guard gave no answer. He was conscious, but his entire body was curled up in a fetal position, his wide eyes unblinking as staring into the distance. Hyperventilating and shaking like a leaf, he mumbled just barely above a whisper. Spiders! Spiders! Get them off me! Huh? Now Benny was deeply confused. What was this guy talking about? Before he could try and ask again, he gave the other security members a glance. For what he could make out, all the guards were suffering the same affliction, scared and weeping and reacting to things he couldn't see. So dark, can't see, cried one of them. Another man swatted at an invisible opponent. Not the clowns, anything but clowns! And another was crawling for the exit, gasping, I want my mommy! Okay, this was just weird. The newbie Dark Knight scratched his head, having no clue what was going on. Was there really a crime being committed, or did he just stumble across some shared mental breakdown? Either way, he wasn't about to leave these guys to fend for themselves, to which he tried to put on his best reassuring superhero voice. Have no fear, Space Bat is here.
How very perceptive of you.
The deep, ominous voice that answered him followed up the response with a long string of maniacal cackling. Benny's head darted every which way as he tried to find the source of the creepy laughter, the echoing sound not doing him any favors, as it seemed to be coming from everywhere. He tried to stand tall as he shouted, "Who's there? Where are you?" More unsettling chuckling.
In the darkest parts of your nightmares.
The astronaut grumbled and shook his head. It was kinda dark in there. It was high time to get some answers, and it would start with finding the darn light switch. Carefully walking backwards to avoid being jumped by anything in the blackness, he fumbled against the wall until his hand brushed against a series of buttons. One by one, different areas of the museum lit up, and the Batman imposter was finally able to get a clear glance at the intruder. The revealed figure recoiled and hissed at the light like a vampire. Dressed in baggy farmer clothes, a straw hat, and a potato sack over his head, the spaceman raised a brow at this more than odd person. A scarecrow? The robber with his jack-o'-lantern face stamped his foot in frustration. Drat, I knew I should have cut those power lines. Though the guy's voice was still a bit deep and raspy, it wasn't nearly as chilling when he talked normal. Nonetheless, Benny braced himself. He wasn't very familiar with this character, but if the straw man was one of Batman's villains, he was in for a mess of trouble. He motioned to the incapacitated guards. Did you do this to them? The Scarecrow shot his enemy a deadpan stare. Well, I didn't exactly pay to get in. Well, that answered that question. It was then the astronaut took notice of the retro rocket engine the thief was trying in vain to hide behind his back, almost in a nonchalant manner, like a kid swiping a cookie. Quick, what would Batman do? Say something witty, Benny thought to himself, having to act the part of vigilante. He then pointed and declared, Something tells me you're not exactly paying for that, either. The villain sneered, having grown used to this routine. Well, normally I would, but I fear I'm low on cash. Suddenly, without warning, the Scarecrow whipped out a pumpkin-shaped grenade and tossed it straight at the superhero. Before the spaceman could react, a tiny explosion enveloped him in a thick cloud of dark gas. Though he couldn't see, he could certainly hear his attacker laughing at him in a taunting manner. Fortunately, the astronaut had a sealed helmet to protect him from the toxic fumes. Calmly walking through the smoke, he faced the thief with a determined expression, raising a brow as if to say, Is that the best you got? Huh? The Scarecrow's jaw dropped in utter disbelief. Boo, blah! He made a few faces and waved his arms in a vain attempt to be spooky. All it earned him was a confused stare. He pulled at his straw hair, looking for all the world like a child throwing a tantrum. Why aren't you scared? You should be wetting yourself in terror. The spaceman blinked. I can already do that in my suit, dude. The villain drew back disgusted as if he was the one horrified. Okay, did not need to know that. Benny scowled. The only thing I need to know is where the nearest police station is. The superhero wannabe was done goofing around. Using his trusty jetpack, he took to the air and shot straight for his foe. The Scarecrow jumped in pure shock and only managed to duck at the last second, the spaceman zooming over his head and missing him by inches. He couldn't hide the surprise in his voice. You can fly? The astronaut hovered a moment trying to get his bearings. I'm a bat, what'd you expect? Not this, that was for certain. The straw man growled in contempt before sprinting away. I don't have time to deal with you, you flying monkey. Well, you definitely need a brain if you think you're getting away with that hyperdrive, Benny snapped. That's a rare model. The Scarecrow could have cared less. All he wanted at that point was to get the heck out of Dodge, especially if his arch nemesis could just take off like Superman. His line of sight was focused purely on the nearby light switches. If he could just black out the lights again, he might have had a fighting chance. But his pace was hindered in no small amount by the weight of the equipment he was trying to swindle. As such, he was forced to hit the ground as the superhero flew a wide arc around and dive-bombed him again. With no choice but to drop the hyperdrive, he barrel-rolled out of his enemy's reach, his back now against a wall. Great. Now he was cornered. Not good. Batman was sure to capture him if he didn't think of something fast. His eyes landed on the fire extinguisher mounted on the wall next to him, and he was struck with the most wicked idea. Yes, that would do nicely. Meanwhile, Benny had to be mindful not to cause any damage to the exhibits as he flew figure eights, waiting for the right moment to swoop in for the catch. The second he noticed that the villain had trapped himself in a corner, he made his move, racing like a speeding bullet, determined to bring this criminal to justice. Until the Scarecrow grabbed the extinguisher and aimed it at him. Time to clip your wings! The straw crook let loose a torrent of foam at his attacker, catching the astronaut totally off guard as it hit him straight in the face. With a wail of surprise, he spun out of control, the villain having to dodge out of the way as Benny crashed to the floor and rebounded against the wall with the force of impact. It took a few seconds for the spaceman to slowly stumble to his feet, head spinning and sight obscured by the flame retardant splattered across his helmet. Wiping the foam did little to help, for it only smeared and made things worse. With no other choice, he lifted the visor to be able to see, hoping the thief didn't escape. And in leaving himself exposed, the villain seized his chance and threw a handful of dust in the superhero's face. Benny recoiled, tightly shutting his eyes as he coughed on the foul-smelling fumes. His attacker cackled, to which the spaceman growled, fully prepared to put up his dukes. What he opened his eyes to was something entirely different. The Scarecrow, the guards, as well as the whole museum had completely disappeared. What surrounded him instead was the burnt shards of floating spaceship debris, floating because he found himself in the starry void of outer space. Where was he? How did he get here? It seemed implausible, yet it felt so real. Confusion compounded his senses. What was going on? What was he supposed to be doing again? He tried to think, but his mind was becoming so foggy he couldn't concentrate to save his life. All he knew for sure that he was totally alone and helpless. "Hello?" he cried out. "Anyone?" Far off in the distance, a spaceship was flying away. His spaceship, and it was leaving without him. He threw out a pleading hand, heart pounding in fear at being abandoned. "No, no, no, don't go! Don't leave me! Someone, anyone, help!" Back in what was the actual reality of the museum, the Scarecrow looked on with a smug grin as the fill-in superhero succumbed to the effects of his fear gas. Benny had curled up in a ball and was rolling on the floor, virtually unaware of where and when he was, breathing heavily and crying out for mercy under his breath. "Maybe you're right, Bats. Maybe I do need a brain," the Scarecrow chuckled, "and it looks like you could use some courage." Not since Lucy's days of being chased by the robotic secret police did she think she'd find herself jumping across rooftops under the moonlight. Apparently some things never changed, no matter how much she was trying to distance herself from her old life. But as she prowled the alleyways, leaping and flipping and turning Gotham into her playground, she realized, in an odd way, she missed doing stuff like this. The thrill of the chase and keeping people, or at least Master Builders, safe. Or rather, admittedly, she missed sharing these moments with Batman. It was how they met to begin with, and she was happy to have found an equal in terms of skill. But then a little thing called the Piece of Resistance happened, and, well, funny how life could change so fast. A twisted irony she'd be taking on the mantle of someone she once loved. She caught herself before thinking too deeply about it and risking reopening an old wound. She was doing this for the good of Gotham and nothing more. Or at least that's what she kept thinking as she decided to check in with her friends. Anything to keep busy. Taking a break on an inconspicuous rooftop, she flipped open her back communicator. "Hey guys, it's Lucy. How are you all holding up?" She gave them a few seconds, but there came no response. Curious, she tried again. "Guys? Am I coming through here? You read me?" Again, all she received was silence. A knot was forming in her stomach as she blurted out, "Emmett? Benny? Guys? Are you there?" Anyone? But nothing answered her back, not even a burst of static. The not DJ's basic instincts were blaring that something was wrong, and a pang of worry hit her briefly, but not wanting to jump to conclusions, she shook off the tense feeling as best she could, hoping the walkie-talkies were just out of range. Well, if her teammates weren't picking up, maybe she could get an update on Bruce's condition instead. Switching channels, she couldn't hide her relief when a familiar British voice spoke. "Hello, Wayne residence." "Hey, Alfred, it's Lucy," the action girl replied. "Nice to hear from you, madam." One could hear the smile in the butler's tone. "How was your masquerade faring?" "Good so far," the villain superhero shook her head. "I don't think these people realize what they take advantage of until it's gone." Alfred knew that all too well. Indeed. It was too late in the night to start getting so philosophical. Lucy got straight to the point. "Speaking of gone, how's Bruce?" "Still very much asleep, though it appears his forced rest is helping the master get through the worst of this bug. His fever finally broke," the Englishman explained with a sigh. "Though even after he wakes up, he'll still need time to fully get well." Clearly the butler was completely exasperated with his boss, to which the not DJ tried to reassure him. "Hopefully Gotham's crime only comes out at night. We're trying our best here, but..." When her voice trailed off, it was Alfred's turn to be the pillar. "Your best is all that you can do, madam, and Master Bruce and I are sincerely grateful to you and your friends for taking on such a risky endeavor." Lucy bit her lip, not knowing until that moment those were the words she needed to hear. Bless the older man and his kindness. "Aw, it's no biggie. It's what friends do. We look out for each other." She could practically see the man smirking on the other end of the line. Of course. As much as she wanted to continue chatting, the city wasn't going to protect itself. Time to get back to work. With the tiniest hesitation, the action girl signed off. "We'll check in with you later. Bye." "Good night," the butler hung up. While Lucy stowed away her communicator, she couldn't help but admit to herself that perhaps Emmett was right. Maybe she did still harbor a few stray feelings for the Dark Knight, if what she said on the phone was anything to go by. But she was left to ponder. Had the roles been reversed, would Batman have been going through as many lengths for her? A few months ago, she would have immediately answered that question with a yes. Now she was unsure. Her worries then drifted to her other friends and why she failed to get a hold of them. If she could phone Alfred, who was miles away from town with no problems, and how could the others have no signal? Unless they weren't in a position to answer, which opened up a ton of uneasy possibilities she had no desire to entertain. But before she could try again, she was pulled from her thoughts by the distinct sound of an explosion. Although it was faint, the echo carried just enough for the not DJ to zero in on the source, a billowing smoke trail marking where the trouble was like a big red arrow. With her dexterity, she could easily make it to the scene before any policeman or fireman could. She already could sound the part of the superhero, time to actually be the part. Like the expert gymnast she was, Lucy cleared the rooftops in a matter of minutes until she found herself overlooking the Gotham Technical Institute. Located near a pier, the steady row of factories and workshops boasted the primary place where all manner of machinery was built to service the city. The superhero stand-in was quick to secure a lookout spot atop the neighboring building. Peering over the ledge to discover the commotion was no accident but a crime in progress. A very weird crime in progress, for the warehouses were being steadily ransacked by a bunch of penguins? As crazy as it looked, there was no denying the sight of rows and rows of the black and white Arctic birds marching out of the workshop doors like a parade. With their wings and atop their heads, they hefted all sorts of computers and other electrical devices, loading them into a giant duck? Lucy had to rub her eyes to ensure her sanity was intact. Thankfully, upon closer inspection, the enormous Maillard was in reality a plane, as evidenced by the jet engine poking out of the tail feathers. She was also fairly certain that real penguins did not have wind-up keys in their backs. They were nothing more than robots. Glad that she wouldn't have to worry about any animal rights activists complaining, the action girl fished in her belt until she found a set of tiny batarangs equivalent to the size of ninja stars. She flung a handful of them down at a random grouping of the little thieves, determined to not allow them to escape with the goods. Her aim was on point, and the reaction was instant. Every last projectile lodged itself in one of the automatons, unleashing an electrical charge that short-circuited their simple mechanisms. Such an attack may have seemed like a drop in a bucket at first, but the few metal birds that fell over caused a domino effect, bumping into other groups until entire rows were toppling like cheap toys. The incident didn't go unnoticed, for just then the giant duck's mouth opened up, revealing the plane's cockpit inside as well as its pilot, a short man in a rather fancy tuxedo sporting a top hat and monocle. He puffed on an overly long cigarette, hacking angry insults to his mechanical minions. "What's the matter with you all? You bubble-brained boobies can't do anything right." Lucy's time with her ex-boyfriend helped her recognize the perp instantly. Stepping into full view, she called out in her best gravelly voice, "Penguin!" The villain glanced up at his name being called, exclaiming, "Hurrah, Batman!" The superhero shot out a bat rope and swung down to the street below. At the same time, the bumbling burglar hopped out of the aircraft to face his arch-enemy, umbrella in hand. "You would show up just as I was about to fly the coop. Why can't you just stick to your own flock and mind your own business?" The phony Dark Knight glared. "Making sure birds like you stay caged is my business." "Not for long," was the only warning the Penguin gave before popping open his umbrella, revealing the black and white swirl design on it. With a dark chuckle, he spun it around like a dizzying pinwheel. Lucy merely raised an unimpressed brow. "Is that supposed to hypnotize me?" "No," her nemesis shook his head simply. "Just give you a splitting headache." The not DJ was done screwing around. "You'll be the one with the headache when I get through with you." She wasted no time in lunging for him, but to her shock, in the blink of an eye, she found the tip of a sword pressed to her throat. No doubt the Penguin used his umbrella as a distraction to whip out the fencing foil he kept hidden inside it. He flashed her a devilish smirk, then pulled back, gearing up to strike. But Lucy could be equally as quick. At the last second, she managed to swivel around and pull up her Kevlar cape, deflecting the attack. The next moment, she was on her feet, revealing an umbrella of her own in hand, patterned with bats, of course. Her foe didn't take kindly to being upstaged, and he spat, "Very well then, on guard!" With those words, Bat and Bird launched into a deadly duel, sword versus umbrella. The not DJ did her best to block and strike, recalling how she managed to defeat those gangs of pirates while sailing with Metalbeard. But for how skilled a fighter she was, the Penguin was clearly the more experienced fencer, seemingly knowing what move she was going to try before she did it. Pretty soon, the villain was on the offensive, forcing his foe to have to open her parasol to shield herself from his unrelenting strikes. And though she remained protected, she was now being slowly backed into a corner. She couldn't keep this up forever. Well, if she was pretending to be Batman, she might as well have copied her adversary too. Holding her umbrella with one hand and praying the villain didn't notice, she dug in her utility belt with her other hand, coming across a handy little aerosol can. And then, the moment the Penguin slowed his assault to catch his breath, the fake Cape Crusader seized her chance and dropped the parasol, spraying him in the face with a strong scented mist that caused him to drop his sword and recoil. As he cried out in pain, she finally glanced at the label on the bottle, wondering just what she had hit him with. Rather than pepper spray, the can read, "Bat Shark Repellent." She supposed beggars couldn't be choosers. She took the opportunity to deliver a solid sucker punch to the top-coated felon while he was indisposed, sending him toppling to the ground. Standing over him in triumph, the battle clearly won. It came as a surprise to her when she found him sneering rather than moping. She asked with a touch of caution, "What are you smiling about?" "Oh, nothing," the Penguin shrugged. "Just that I'm about to wrap up my errands." Ha ha! The action girl folded her arms. "I don't think so." The villain raised a brow. "Oh, no?" He waved a hand all around, to which Lucy finally glanced up, noticing for the first time that the small army of robot penguins had formed a complete circle around the dueling pair, effectively surrounding them. But the stand-in superhero was hardly intimidated by a bunch of wind-up toys, whipping out a batarang for good measure. But before she could make a move, the bird leader shook his head. "I wouldn't be too hasty. It would be a shame to have to blow up all my minions, especially when they're in such proximity to the locals." Ha ha! Instantly, the not DJ's heart froze and her stomach lurched. These things were bombs? She couldn't fathom the possibility of them all exploding at once. They could take out a whole city block. They already caused enough damage to the factory they were stealing from. But if they were so reckless, it would also mean turning their creator into a fried turkey. She glared at the madman and called his bluff. "You're lying." The Penguin fixed her with a mischievous glare. "Do you really want to take that risk?" Lucy gritted her teeth, but dropped the batarang in surrender, realizing he was right. The fact that she could hear more than a few of the tin birds ticking just proved he had the superior bargaining chip. In her mind, she swore at herself for getting so distracted so as to allow herself to be surrounded like that. How could she make such a rookie mistake? The felon kept her from speaking. One false move and we all go boom. The not DJ wasn't about to gamble. She could only watch as he calmly rose to his feet, making a show of dusting himself off and lavishing in the enjoyment of putting Batman on the spot. He even graced her with a curtsy. Well, I'd best be going while the night is young, but I'll end our little scuffle with a piece of advice. He then scooped up his discarded umbrella and pointed it at her. Don't get overconfident. Ha! Much like the shark repellent, he returned the favor by spraying a thick purple gas in her face. Lucy had no chance of dodging it and gasped, the sporific air filling her lungs and making her lightheaded and dizzy. As the realm of unconsciousness took hold of her, the only thing she could manage to mumble was, "Darn." When Unikitty scribbled all over herself in black magic marker and donned a construction paper emblem and cape, she told herself she'd have to be ready for anything. She wasn't expecting to have to also rescue wayward cats from trees. But the princess hardly minded. Being a hero wasn't just about beating up bad guys, it was also coming to the help citizens in need, even the four-legged kind like her. It was nary a problem for her to use her levitation magic to fish the orange tabby cat from the oak tree and into the awaiting arms of a very grateful little girl who beamed, "Thank you!" "No problem." The unicorn cat spoke with the deepest voice she could muster. Had to stay in character, after all. "All in a night's work." The tiny feline meowed, to which his owner translated,
Ginger says thank you too.
Unikitty knew that wasn't the only thing her non-magical counterpart replied. "He also says he's not going out in the garden again."
Don't worry, I won't let him.
The girl hugged her grumpy pet close before waving.
I gotta go now. Bye.
Unikitty smirked and nodded, watching the child scurry back into her apartment building just to be sure she made it home safe. Only after the door closed did the princess puff her chest with pride. "I've done a good deed today." Unfortunately, she wasn't celebrating for very long, for just then, with her superior feline hearing, she picked up the unmistakable sound of an alarm far off in the distance. But such a warning did little to discourage her. In fact, her heart pounded with excitement as she narrated her own adventure like one would read a comic book. "Oh, sounds like I'm gonna have 2 good deeds tonight. To the Catmobile!" But seeing as there was no car waiting for her, she had to resort to assembling it herself, which was no problem for a master builder. With great speed, she dashed across the street to the nearby scrap metal yard, paws and magic swirling in a massive glittery tornado, until within a minute she was the proud owner of a pink, purple, and black go-kart, the likes of which befitting a unique superhero like her. She pedaled down the street like no one's business, singing an appropriate theme tune as she raced to the rescue. Na 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 bad cat! Any normal person would have been deterred by a few hidden cameras, laser defenses, and triple locks on display cases, but for the black-suited and feline-eared Catwoman, it was just another fun walk in the park. The feminine burglar was just finishing up using her sharpened claws to carve a perfect circle in the protective glass surrounding a rare old map. Suffice it to say, the Gotham History Museum had definitely amped up its security measures since the last time she visited, but the blaring alarm did little to worry her. She was just about to leave anyway. Sipping an arm through the hole she made, she was seconds away from pocketing the parchment when a voice shouted, "Unhand that old piece of paper!" "Huh?" The thief turned on her heel. The police couldn't have gotten there that quickly, could they? She took a fighting stance. "Who's there?"
Your worst nightmare.
An ominous shadow fell over Catwoman, to which she followed the source, her gaze rising upward to the skylight windows above. An unfamiliar silhouette was framed in the moonlight, speaking in as intimidating a voice as they could muster.
I am what goes bump in the night. I am the one hiding under your bed, teeth ground sharp and eyes glowing red. I'm...
They then seemed to catch themselves.
Wait, that's the Nightmare Before Christmas. Sorry.
They cleared their throat and bellowed, I am Batcat! The disguised Unikitty then took a flying leap from the rafters, reaching into her belt and throwing some pellets on the way down. The capsules exploded into a thick smoke, to which the confused burglar stared at this weird figure emerge from the fog in a spooky manner, then promptly smiled.
Did you like my dramatic entrance?
Catwoman wasn't interested in playing Olympic scorecard. What are you supposed to be?
I'm Batman's new sidekick.
The princess held her chin high with a proud and confident smirk. The feline felon was far from impressed and hissed, "There's only enough room in this town for one cat, and that's me." She decided to let her trusty bullwhip do the rest of the talking. With lightning speed, the femme fatale unleashed her weapon on the unsuspecting superhero, cracking and snapping with a determined fury. But what she hadn't counted on was the fact that this new sidekick had just as agile reflexes, perhaps even more so considering she was an actual cat. With all the agility and grace of a dancer, Unikitty jumped and swerved, dodging every blow, while also creeping ever closer to her assailant, until she finally delivered a solid headbutt with her horn, shouting, "Biff!" Catwoman reeled from the blow, dropping the whip. The princess saw her chance and gave her a swat of her tail for good measure, yelling more sound effects. Bam! Zap! The villain staggered backward, trying in vain to recover before the caped kitten could finish her off. In desperation, she grabbed the nearest object to her, a priceless vase, and chucked it at her attacker, but the magic cat could see it coming from a mile off and easily ducked, charging then leaping into the air with a cry of "Kapow!" Before the burglar could react, Unikitty had landed on top of her in a move that would make any football player jealous. She calmly sat atop her back, pinning down the humiliated thief flat as a pancake. And just in time, too, for the expensive vase was still falling and the floor wasn't getting any softer. The princess gasped, letting out a burst of levitation magic which caught the artifact at the last second. She set it down gently, sighing in relief before scolding her foe.
Didn't you ever hear of you break it, you buy it?
Even while lying mortified on the ground, Catwoman grumbled, "And didn't you ever hear that this cat has claws?" Suddenly, with a free hand, the thief reached up and took an angry swipe at her captor. The magic cat, taken completely off guard, yelped in surprise and jumped back, allowing the felon a chance to spring to her feet. But the princess was more concerned with inspecting her paw, which now sported a deep and slightly bleeding scratch mark. She glared and huffed like a kid who caught another kid cheating.
"Hey, that wasn't very nice. Now you're gonna get it."
But only a few seconds into gearing up to charge, the unicorn cat instantly knew something was wrong. The room had seemingly begun to spin, her vision becoming blurrier by the second. Her feet wobbled as she tried to shake off the dizziness, but it was no use. She was falling asleep, and fast. All the while, Catwoman smirked. "Sorry if I don't play nice. I'm also sorry I forgot to mention the knockout poison my claws are laced with. It's kind of a new trick I'm practicing. Enjoy your cat nap." But Unikitty barely heard her. No less than 3 images of the feline felon were dancing around her vision, and she soon gave up the fight to keep her eyes open, collapsing to the floor. The last thing she heard before blacking out was the chilling sound of the cat burglar mockingly laughing at her. Unikitty. 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 The princess could barely make out the voice. It sounded so distant. "Wake up. Please. Wake up. Please. Wake up." How could she? The world was dipping in and out of focus, making it near impossible to shake off the haziness. She just wanted to go back to sleep. 5 more minutes. Whoever was calling to her didn't take kindly to her whining. Said person gave her a hard shove in the ribs and said, loudly and firmly, "Unikitty, wake up!" The familiar voice caught her attention. Though everything was still a blur, the unicorn cat finally managed to shake herself back to the land of consciousness, or at least enough to realize that something was very wrong. Moving proved to be a hassle, to which she glanced down at the sound of clinking metal, surprised to discover she was bound by chains, and tied back to back with 2 other people. One of her captive friends was Lucy, the one who had been calling out to her for the past 5 minutes. The action girl turned her head. "Unikitty, you awake?" "Sort of." The princess hated to admit to wanting to stay in that dream world for just a tad longer. Trying to fight the urge to go to sleep was making her nauseated. "What's going on?" The not DJ sighed, wondering how to summarize her situation. Let's just say we're a little tied up. After Lucy had woken up from her own forced nap at the hands of the Penguin, she quickly took stock of a few things. She wasn't at the Technical Institute anymore, but in some kind of warehouse. Her friends were with her, and their masks had been pulled off along with their utility belts. They were chained together, and they were dangling several feet in the air over a boiling vat of something that she was certain could probably kill them.
What are we doing here?
Unikitty asked the obvious.
Where is here? Where is everyone?
To answer that, I don't know. I don't know either, and I think it's you, me, and Benny. The not DJ sadly glanced at the spaceman. Well, Benny sort of here. To emphasize her point, the astronaut seemed to not even hear the girl's conversation. Still trapped under the influence of the Scarecrow's fear gas, he was too busy sweating and shaking and mumbling under his breath. Don't leave me alone. Please don't leave me. Please. The Unicorn Cat pondered what was wrong with her friend, but an even more pressing matter occurred to her.
What about Emmett? Where's he at?
A crestfallen expression passed over Lucy a moment. I don't know. Well, they weren't going to get any answers by just hanging around and doing nothing. The Action Girl began kicking her legs, trying anything to wiggle the chains loose, but all her efforts amounted to just spinning the trio around in a circle. When she tired herself out, she looked towards the princess. Unikitty, listen. You've got to use your magic. Levitate us or do something. Get us out of here. The Unicorn Cat didn't need to be told twice. She scrunched her eyes as she attempted to channel her powers, but her horn merely lit up for a second, then fizzled like a blown-out candle. Whatever Catwoman's poison did to her, it was keeping her just groggy enough that concentrating proved painful. She gasped for breath as if she just ran a marathon. I'm trying. I can't. Still too tired. Lucy had to hold back from groaning. It wasn't her friend's fault that they were stuck like this. She then turned to the spaceman, refraining from letting any panic seep into her voice. Benny, you gotta fly us out of here. But the astronaut shook his head, still not comprehending. Don't fly away. Come back. The not DJ practically kicked him in frustration. Benny, snap out of it. He can't hear you superhero phonies, someone shouted in deep or raspy tones. In fact, he is more frightened of his own left hand than the acid bath you're about to take. While the Action Girl couldn't exactly place the voice, she certainly knew the villain by face when from one of the cargo doors flung open and a creepy individual stepped into view. Hours spent with the Dark Knight ensured her a base knowledge of his rogues gallery, including Scarecrow. She glared daggers at him, wanting nothing more than to get payback for what he did to Benny. The straw man merely snickered, not at all intimidated. Before long, two more people entered the room, causing Lucy to shout, "And Penguin!" and her eyes widened. Catwoman? The tuxedo-wearing troublemaker tipped his hat, amused at her confusion. Quite the ensemble, isn't it, dear? Although it made sense, the not DJ didn't want to believe it. If these three had teamed up, they were in big trouble. You're all working together? And this is surprising. The cat burglar casually filed her nails. Superheroes aren't the only ones who can make friends. Lucy silently cursed her bad luck, but she wasn't about to appear weak in front of these felons. What's going on? What's your big plan? I don't think you're in a position to negotiate, girlie. The Penguin took a drag from his cigarette. That's for us to know, and you'd never find out. And you're one to talk, Catwoman added in, her tone curious. Why were you four playing dress-up? The Action Girl instantly noticed the thief said "for," which could only mean one thing, which made her start thrashing about. First you tell us where Emmett is. He's right here. As if things couldn't get any worse, and yet another non-do-gooder decided to join the party. Lucy blinked at the redhead, partly surprised and partly exasperated. Poison Ivy? Said evil botanist was nothing but smiles as she stepped aside, to reveal an unmasked but very much alive construction worker. Emmett! His girlfriend cried out in immeasurable relief. Are you okay? I'm fine. The special spoke slowly and carefully, almost as if in a daze. With my mistress, everything's fine. Lucy raised an eyebrow. That most certainly did not sound like a guy being held captive, much less her boyfriend. Emmett? What are you? But her words died in her mouth when she took notice of his slightly green complexion. Whatever was going on, the construction worker wasn't himself. She flashed a hateful eye towards the villainess. What did you do to him? Instead of answering, Ivy chose to walk around her mind slave in a most flirtatious manner, caressing his cheek as she crooned, "Would you be so kind as to tell us where the real Batman is?" The special had no hesitation in replying, "He's in bed with the flu." And I thought Mr. Freeze gave us the cold shoulder. Catwoman shook her head, almost offended her archenemy didn't give her the time of day. If the evil botanist was purposely doing this just to make Lucy jealous, then not DJ hated to admit it was working. Not to mention that by now it was very clear the construction worker was under some sort of trance. She yelled out, "Emmett, don't tell him anything!" Poison Ivy flat out ignored her, eyes completely focused on her victim as she asked with great excitement, "Very well then, I've got a better question. Who is Batman?" Lucy's heart practically stopped. All she could think to scream was, "No!" Too late, Emmett smiled and said, "Bruce Wayne." There came a long pause as several pairs of eyebrows rose and a few jaws dropped. Catwoman blinked, almost unbelieving. Really? The billionaire? Benny may have still been trapped in his illusion, but Unikitty and Lucy especially held their breath. Until Scarecrow spoke. Why would that lame brain with that much money be busting his butt every night like this? He couldn't wrap his head around the idiotic logic. If I had that much moolah, I'd be on a tropical island somewhere. The Penguin nodded in agreement. And how can that winged rodent get around the city so fast? Darn commissioner probably got a whole army of 'em that sweeps the whole town. He poked Emmett like a broken toy. Probably just a dumb answer he's trained to give. He pointed towards the master builders for emphasis, to which Lucy sighed in relief. Thank the man upstairs for small mercies. These jerks were smart, but not that smart. Poison Ivy pouted, seeing the logic, but hating to accept an answer she wasn't hoping for. Well, I suppose it doesn't really matter in the end. Once we finish up our business, we won't have to worry about anyone standing up to us ever again. She shrugged before turning to leave. We're wasting time here. Let's go. The Penguin pointed at their captives. What about the vile vigilantes? Ah, yes, almost forgot. The redhead paused as if remembering. She then turned to the phony superheroes with a wicked grin. We felt kind of bad for you all working so hard to keep the peace, so we set up a nice little one-way spa treatment for you, she winked. Does wonders for the skin. The Not DJ looked ready to strangle her. Her voice dripped with sarcasm. Oh, how thoughtful. We also thought it best if your friend did the honors. Ivy wrapped an arm around the special as she told him. Make sure they stay in there for a good long time, until you can't hear their screams anymore. Blissfully unaware of those horrible implications, the hypnotized construction worker grinned. Yes, mistress. The villainess patted him on the head like a dog. You're such a sweetheart. Up until that point, Lucy wasn't too overly frightened of her current circumstances. She'd been through worse, but she could never fathom the very idea of one of her best friends, brainwashed or not, sending her to her doom. Her eyes widened as a bottled-up panic began to finally spill over. Wait, Emmett, what are you doing? If her boyfriend heard her, he didn't reply. Instead, he turned to a control panel on the wall and flipped the switch. With a chilling clicking sound, the trio of Batman began to slowly descend into the boiling acid pot. All the while, Catwoman waved, "Enjoy your bath. In the meantime, you can think about what happens when you try to play superhero. Later." With that, the four supervillains let out a gaggle of mocking cackles as they left the warehouse with a confidence that only came from someone who knew they had won. Penguin's bird plane was waiting for them just outside, to which the quartet boarded the aircraft and took off, leaving the stand-in superheroes to fend for themselves. With what little time they had remaining, that is. Lucy, for her part, was hyperventilating by that point. They had maybe 2 minutes tops before they'd be turned into heroic skeletons. With Benny still stuck in a nightmare and Unikitty's magic not at 100%, what could she do? And the closer they got, the more those chemicals weren't looking any more soothing. There was only one hope. The Not DJ spun her and her friends around on the chain until she was facing her boyfriend. Emmett, get us down! but the hypnotized construction worker merely stood at his post as instructed, watching his ever-lowing friends with the same dazed smile. The action girl tried again. "Emmett, snap out of it! Whatever they did to you, you gotta fight it!" The special replied in a monotone voice. "I must do what Ivy asked me to do." "Why?" his girlfriend practically screamed. "Because she loves me." Emmett's babbling turned wistful. "So I must help her to thank her." "You're being stupid!" Lucy growled out of pure frustration. But a second later, she forced herself to breathe, calm down, and focus. It wasn't her boyfriend's fault he was put under a spell, and anger wouldn't get them anywhere, especially with that chain clicking lower and lower. Time to fight back with what saved everyone on Taco Tuesday. Her words. "Come on, Emmett, think," she all but begged. "What's Ivy ever done for you?" While the construction worker still didn't move, his love-struck smile slowly faded. The one tiny change didn't go unnoticed by his girlfriend. Just like she hoped, she had hit onto something. Combat false love with logic. With less than a minute to spare, she kept talking. "If she really loved you, would she have left you like that? Doing things for herself and making it sound like she's doing it for you?" Before all the words even left her lips, the full weight of what she said hit her like a ton of bricks. In the span of a few seconds, the action girl flashed back to that day in the Batmobile, when Batman boasted that heavy metal song he wrote for her, with lyrics that were only about him. Or when she had to remind him to be there for her when he exclaimed "every man for himself" when escaping Cloud Cuckoo Land. Or when he bailed on them on Metalbeard's boat without even telling her he'd be back. Had her hands been free, she would have face-palmed. Irony could be so cruel. But with the acid drawing ever closer, there was no time to mope. Lucy snapped to attention, her long unspoken feelings bubbling over as she tried desperately to break through to her entranced friend. "Please, Emmett, you've got to remember. Remember when no one believed you could beat Lord Business, but you tried anyway?" She bit her lip. "Or when you told me I was an amazing person, and you jumped out the window to save us?" The construction worker rubbed his eyes as if pained by a headache. I can't. By then, the not DJ was rambling, her words falling out a mile a minute. "How about when we had that big food fight at your house? Or when you told me that I could stay with you?" The chain was still clicking, her voice was cracking. "Were all those times that you tried to protect us? To protect me? Even when you knew you couldn't win?" Her lower lip quivered. "You're such a big dummy. But She could bear it no longer or deny it. Close to tears, her voice was just loud enough to hear. "I love you." Maybe it was her words, or maybe it was pure luck that Ivy's spell wore off at that moment. Perhaps a bit of both. But no matter the reason, at that second, Emmett blinked and shook his head, rubbing his eyes as he muttered, as if awakening from a dream. "Lucy?" He glanced up at her, really looked at her, the green tint to his skin slowly fading, his normal friendliness and warmth back in his eyes. With the knowledge that her words actually did something, the action girl was so exhilarated to have her boyfriend back she hardly noticed she was less than a foot away from certain doom. Thankfully, the construction worker fully snapped to attention upon processing the peril its friends were in and let out a gasp. "Oh my gosh!" Scrambling for the controls next to him, he managed to locate the off switch and promptly stop the descending chain. Just in the nick of time, too, for the not DJ had to lift her legs to keep out of reach of the deadly liquid. She breathed a sigh of pure relief. That was far too close for comfort. "Lucy, are you guys okay?" Emmett nervously bounced on his heels in confusion. What happened? What's going on?" His girlfriend tried to sound more grateful, and she was annoyed. "Well, I'd love to tell you, but I'd rather swap stories when I'm not dangling over a vat of acid." Oh, right. The special practically smacked his forehead in a rather, well, duh moment. "Let me just..." But his words fell short upon closer inspection of the wall controls. Part of the panel, which should have been lit up like the other switches, remained dark. When he pushed the up lever, nothing happened. Ever the captain of the obvious, he threw open his arms. "The reverse button won't work." No doubt the villains busted the controls beforehand to ensure their foes met their fate. Lucy was about ready to throw a fit. Now what? She racked her brain for a new idea before turning once more to the astronaut tied up with her. Benny? The spaceman gave a start. Lucy? The not DJ was nearly startled at the use of her name. He actually responded to her that time. That was a good sign. Perhaps the Scarecrow's fear gas was finally wearing off. Maybe she could talk him out of his induced paranoia the same way she did Emmett. One could only hope. She spoke as calmly as she could muster. Benny, listen. You've got to use your anti-grav powers to float us over this vat. I can't. The spaceman shook his head, still fooled by the illusion of being abandoned in the cosmos. Can't float away. Gotta get back to the spaceship. There's no spaceship, Benny, Lucy insisted. Now the astronaut was confused. Her words versus what he was seeing in his mind's eye wasn't adding up. There isn't? No, there is no spaceship. Whatever's going on in that head of yours, it's not real. The action girl kept her tone firm. You're not in outer space. You're with us. You're safe. Emmett winced. Well, sort of. His girlfriend shushed him before continuing, staying reassuring. Benny, please listen. Remember what Metalbeard told you, what we all told you. You will never be left alone again, okay? She hoped what she was saying was encouraging enough. The Scarecrow's just trying to scare you, but I know you're tougher than this. Now you've got to fly us out of here and save us. Benny went still a moment, processing everything he was being told. Batman being sick, his friends, the mission. It was all coming back to him. Nonetheless, there was a lingering hesitation. But I'm scared. Lucy all but hung her head with a touch of shame, as if embarrassed to admit something she would have never revealed had the circumstances been different. But she swallowed her pride and sputtered, So what? I get scared all the time. Emmett and Unikitty blinked in surprise, speaking at the same time. You do? The not DJ nearly laughed at their shock. Was it so hard to believe she got frightened when fighting crime or jumping off buildings or being chased by monsters? All those years on the run with the secret police breathing down her neck made her jumpy enough. She blushed as she confessed. Well, just because you get afraid doesn't mean you can't fight back. There came a long pause. The logic made perfect sense. And with that sound advice in mind, Benny nodded. You're right. I had to save myself. And I can save us. With a new determination, the astronaut came to his senses and managed to shake off the last of the fear gas. There was nothing left to hold him back as he concentrated on bending the gravity around his friends in much the same manner that he levitated himself. And slowly but carefully, the trio, still tied up, began floating of their own accord, passing over top the acid like a fog cloud, until they had safely descended to the cold but welcoming floor. Immediately Emmett began untying his frazzled friends. All the while Lucy grumbled, I'm not a DJ, but apparently I am a therapist, she pouted. Bruce is gonna pay big time for all this. I'm so sorry, guys. Benny waved off the construction workers concerned. Really, dude, it's okay.
Yeah, Unikitty nodded. We weren't much better either.
It took everyone a couple minutes to get fully untied and double-check that they were all truly alright and unharmed. Thankfully, by then, Benny was back to normal, and Unikitty's magic had nearly fully returned. That just left having to calm Emmett down after they filled him in on just what he had done while under Poison Ivy's influence. Needless to say, he was riding the guilt train full speed ahead, apologizing every other sentence, but his friends easily forgave him, safe in the assurance that since everybody was okay, that was all that really mattered. They had bigger fish to fry at the moment. Since they all had been unmasked and robbed of their utility belts, the master builders didn't see the need for their disguises anymore. So after changing back into their plain clothes, conveniently being worn underneath the suits, the quartet were left standing in a circle and pondering what to do. Their options were limited, to say the least. So, the bad guys could be anywhere by now. They've got our stuff, and we got nothing to work with to build a ride out of here. Lucy waved a hand at the empty warehouse around them. The foursome practically slumped over, staring sheepishly at one another and barely contained shame at their failure. The princess finally broke the awkward quiet.
We really messed up.
The astronaut shook his head in disbelief. I don't get it. We had the costumes, the gadgets, the one-liners. What did we do wrong? He rubbed his chin. How does Batman do it? The not DJ crossed her arms in a huff. 'Cause he's Batman, I guess, she blushed. And we're not. There came another pause as the builders tried to think of a plan but kept coming up short. Until the proverbial idea bulb came on and Emmett's eyes lit up. You're right. I am? His girlfriend raised a brow. Yeah, the special nodded. We're not Batman. The spaceman blinked, utterly perplexed. You say that like that's a good thing. No, what I mean is, the construction worker facepalmed as he found the right words. All this time we keep screwing up because we're trying to do things the way Batman does it. So instead of trying to be something we're not, he shrugged, why don't we just fight our own ways? His three friends stared at him for a second, soaking in his explanation that by all accounts was so simple. Why didn't they think of it before? Leave it to the special to point out the obvious. After looking at one another with a knowing smile, they all nodded at him, Lucy chiming in. Now you're sounding like a superhero. Her look of pride towards the perceptiveness of her boyfriend turned to one of confusion, as just then there came the unmistakable but strange sound of something rumbling, a rumbling that was steadily drawing closer to them by the minute. Only when the door began to vibrate and there came a great rush of air through the still open doorway did the builders hurry outside to find out just what the sudden commotion was. Did those villains decide to come back to make sure they were dead? Was some new bad guy showing up? Could this night get any worse? They couldn't have been more wrong. To everyone's utmost shock, the welcoming sight of the jet-black Batplane was coming in for a precision landing in the one empty space available. But how could it be? Did Batman somehow get well again? Did he catch wind of what they were up to and was coming to help them? Things just got more baffling when the cockpit flipped open to reveal the lack of a pilot. The seats were empty. What the heck? Lucy wondered out loud over the roar of the engine. The mystery was solved when a British accented voice suddenly announced over the plane's speaker system. I do hope I'm not too fashionably late. Yay! Unikitty cheered. Alfred to the rescue! Benny was just as grateful. How did you find us? The calm tones of the butler asked. I'm safe to assume you all encountered less than friendly characters in your patrols. Something like that, yeah. Lucy shot the aircraft a deadpan expression. How'd you know? It would appear your utility belts were tampered with. Back here at the house, an emergency SOS alarm was tripped. The bat computer then locked onto your location and sent the plane on autopilot, the Englishman explained. I also found it odd you weren't answering your communicators. Sorry, the astronaut grinned. We were just hanging around. The not DJ rolled her eyes at the pun, but it was hard to stay mad when she was so happy to finally have some good news. Bless the butler and his excellent timing. He went on to add, I hope it's to your liking. Light couldn't even begin to cover it. The action girl smiled in relief. Alfred, you're the best. I try, the Englishman said simply. Best of luck to you all. Emmett's eyes became as wide as saucers as he practically shook with excitement. We get to fly the Batplane? Awesome! The special was jumping up and down like a kid on Christmas. The astronaut hated to spoil his moment. More like, I get to fly the plane. I am a pilot after all. No one could argue with that. Not wanting to waste any more time, the master builders boarded the infamous aircraft, taking the first seats they could grab while the spaceman slid into the driver's chair. At the same time the hatch was closing, Unikitty pointed to something on the dashboard. Look at the blip on the radar thingy! True to her word, a bright red blob was moving further away from the gang's central point indicated on the circle of a map. Lucy glared at the screen as if it did her an injustice. That's gotta be those creeps. But they're so far away, Emmett squinted out the window. How are we gonna catch up? Leave it to me, Benny proclaimed with utter confidence as he began to mess with the controls, which only resulted in the headlights blinking. Sorry, the astronaut blushed at his mistake, trying another lever. Maybe it's this one? But upon turning on the windshield wipers, he was steadily losing his earlier bravado. He scratched his head, now willing to try anything at random, anything to get him off the ground. Maybe this one? He picked another switch and instantly regretted it. One of Batman's self-indulgent heavy metal songs began blasting through the stereo speakers at an ear-splitting volume. A baritone voice belted out.
Darkness! No parents! Continue darkness! More darkness, get it? The opposite of light!
Everyone winced and covered their ears, all while Benny pushed every button in a furious panic. But all it earned him was activating signal flares, car alarms, and blasted confetti. Even the hardcore action girl could only take so much, and she yelled over the noise, "Do something! I'm trying! The controls on this jet are all backwards!" The astronaut tried to explain before slamming his hands on the dashboard and groaning in defeat. "I wish this thing was a spaceship!" Just then, as if by the grace of the man upstairs himself, everything shut off. The wipers, the alarms, the lights, the music, it all came to a sudden stop. The quartet's mouths hung open at the deafening silence, until an electric voice responded, "Spaceship mode activated." Apparently, the astronaut must have spoken a key word, for suddenly, to the shell-shocked surprise of everyone, the jet on its own accord began breaking apart, its many sections shifting and twisting and turning, transforming into something different. Less than a minute later, gone was the jet plane, and in its place was the familiar form and shape of Benny's favorite mode of transportation, all black and gray, of course. "Download complete," the computer announced. "Bat shuttle prepared for launch." The three passengers all let out soft gasps of amazement. Finally, something was going right today. The astronaut threw his hands in the air and cheered for their good luck. "Aw, yeah, now that's what I'm talking about!" He grabbed the steering wheel with glee. "Spaceship!" With that, Benny initiated liftoff and held no hesitation in flooring the gas. The ship rocketed into the air at breakneck speed, so fast the builders were pushed back into their seats by the sheer force. But their lack of comfort was a small price to pay, for in no time flat a familiar giant bird appeared on the horizon line, and judging by the clouds zipping by and the way Penguin's plane seemed to be growing in size, they were closing in. Fast. Perhaps a bit too fast, for Emmett finally asked, "Anyone got a plan here?" Benny stuck his tongue out in concentration. "Just give me a second, I can take out their engine." He quickly discovered the targeting system and began to zero in on their runaway foes, but as much as the group wanted to take some sweet revenge, Unikitty was swift to stop him as she remembered, "No, wait! We gotta get back the stuff they stole!" Lucy's eyes narrowed at the avian aircraft. "Leave that to me." With a grim determination, she turned to the astronaut. "Can you get right up next to them?" "Yeah?" The spaceman raised a brow, wondering what she was up to. She nodded. "Do it." Benny didn't even question her, trusting that she knew what she was doing. With a skill and precision that came so naturally to him, the astronaut readjusted his altitude, slowing down and speeding up until he came to be flying parallel to the fake bird, the plane so close their wingtips were nearly touching. Which is exactly what the not DJ was counting on, and as talented a pilot she knew her friend was, she also knew he couldn't hold his position forever. As she flung open the cockpit hatch, she yelled over the howling wind, "Keep her steady!" Before anyone could convince her otherwise than what she was about to attempt was completely insane, the action girl climbed out onto the shuttle's wing. With her eyes squinting against the stinging air, she carefully began stepping across the wing in a move that would make any tightrope walker jealous. Her awestruck friends could do nothing but watch as she made it to the end, pausing to stare at the small gap between her aircraft and the one she planned to board. It was only a foot of space, but for how high in the sky they were, it might as well have been a mile away. Praying to the man upstairs, she jumped, and landed none too gracefully on the other side. Emmett's heart leapt to his throat. Unikitty cheered. Benny was too focused on keeping the plane level. And as for Lucy, she simply turned and waved, winking as if the stunt she just pulled happened every day of the week. But back to business. Jogging across the wing of the duck proved a bit easier. Even simpler was locating the hatch on the bird's back, to which the action girl whipped open the door and jumped down the hole. What she fell into was a cargo plane not too dissimilar to the inside of the Bat shuttle, save for the piles of stolen loot and the quartet of villains who all swiveled around, caught by surprise at their unexpected stowaway. The Penguin, who was in the pilot's seat, nearly spat out his cigarette as his jaw dropped. "What the?" "Special delivery," the not DJ flashed a mocking grin. With no further comment, she then grabbed a random filched computer and chucked it at the stunned felons. Too shocked were they to immediately fight back, they were flattened instantly. Their struggle was a long enough distraction that they certainly not dead folk could hoist up the pointed laser, followed by the hyperdrive, then the old document, and finally whatever random bits of machinery she could grab and toss out the still open hatch. Only when she made her own escape did the Penguin scream, "Hey!" Where did she come from? The Scarecrow couldn't imagine how their victims escaped their death trap. The tuxedo-wearing thief was less concerned with the technicals and more with stealing back their loot. Who cares? Get her! Catwoman was all too eager to oblige, also in part because she recovered from the surprise attack first. Not wanting to be out-burglarized by some punk in a hoodie, the burglar scrambled up the ladder, popping her head out the hatch just in time to witness their unexpected intruder tossing all the goods back to an awaiting shuttle, that pesky unicorn cat catching it all with her magic. To that end, the feline felon jumped aboard the roof and extended her sharp weapons, ready to attack. Her stealth tactics didn't go unnoticed by the princess. Just as she was securing the last of the missing items, she caught sight of the villainess sneaking up behind her friend and gasped, "Watch out for her claws!" Lucy heard the warning in the nick of time and whirled around, just barely dodging Catwoman's hand swipe before delivering a swift punch to the face. The burglar staggered backwards but was undeterred, lunging for the hoodie-wearing heroine with a great ferociousness. The two then began duking it out atop the birdplane, exchanging a flurry of flips and kicks that was near impossible for the naked eye to track. And though Emmett was confident in his girlfriend's fighting prowess, there was no denying each lady was equally matched in terms of kung fu skills. Below the action, the Penguin scowled at the sound of heavy footsteps on the roof. Are they fighting or doing a dance? Truth be told, it was a bit of both. It only took a minute for Lucy to figure out Catwoman's pattern of attack and respond accordingly, artfully dodging the worst of the blows, while also maneuvering closer to the edge of their tiny arena. The Penguin managed to outsmart her with his distraction tactics. Time for the shoe to be on the other foot. Nice friends you got there, she spoke with as much sarcasm as possible. I don't see them rushing up to help you. I don't need their help. The cat burglar caught her breath, though it was clear the comment touched a nerve. I can finish you with one claw behind my back. Oh yeah? Prove it, 'cause something tells me you're gonna need those 9 lives, the action girl sneered, egging on her opponent. I don't need to be a superhero to beat you. She capped off her taunt by sticking out her tongue. That did it. Catwoman let loose a snarl, her rage boiling over as she charged full force at the girl who had dared to make fun of her, only for Lucy to cartwheel out of the way. Her sprint was too fast for her to stop, and with her anger instantly shifting to a wide-eyed expression of surprise, then horror, the cat burglar went tumbling over the edge of the plane, her screams drowning out as she fell further into oblivion. Inside the bird, Scarecrow and Poison Ivy covered their mouths in fear as they stared out the window, watching their partner in crime drop like a rock and land with a splash in Gotham's harbor far below. The straw man muttered, "Hope cats know how to swim." Penguin, however, was fed up with the entire affair of having the rug pulled out from under him and angrily handed Ivy the controls, stomping over to a supply closet. "Do I have to do everything myself?" Meanwhile, back over on the Bat Shuttle, Lucy's acrobatics got her safely back across the wingspans. Having done it once assured her confidence she could very well pull it off again. She hopped back in the cockpit to the sounds of happy yelling and pats on the back. Unikitty bounced in her seat. "That was amazing!" "Thanks," the Not DJ flashed a smile of pride. "We're not done yet, though." She turned to Benny. "Okay, now you can blast 'em." But the spaceman was focused on the strange sight happening in front of him. "Hey, look!" Everyone glanced toward what he was pointing at. The moment Lucy returned, he had pulled back, so they were now sailing behind their enemy again, if only to get a decent shot. What was perplexing was the back hatch of the giant bird opening up while in flight, revealing the Penguin staring angrily at the quartet, even if he couldn't see them. He was too far away to make out details, but the felon definitely had something in his hands. Benny squinted, confused. "What's he doing?" The villain made his intent clear in about 3 seconds. He promptly threw the object directly at their windshield. As it sailed closer, Lucy's eyes widened when she recognized the weapon, one of his wind-up robots. "Flying penguins!" Unikitty exclaimed, horrified that anyone would treat an animal in such a manner. "No," the Not DJ's face paled. "Flying bombs!" She practically tackled the controls in a panic, fearful that the astronaut wouldn't react in time. Her quick response sent the shuttle into a nosedive just as the projectile exploded, doing little harm but rocking the ship all the same. In their brief free fall, Benny had to wonder if his friend's hastiness would send them to an early grave more than the villains would. But he had no moment to dwell, instead having to gain back control and rewrite the plane in the span of a few seconds. At the same time, the Penguin began chucking his robots at the heroes without pause, dive-bombing his enemies with combustile tin toys that fell out of the birdplane's butt like deadly rain. The less than pleasant image wasn't lost on Lucy, who pulled a face. Okay, that's just gross. Benny could have cared less, more focused on keeping them alive. Everybody hang on! He launched into evasive maneuvers, performing a slew of barrel rolls and loop-de-loops as feathery explosions blew up all around them, as if being caught in the middle of a 4th of July fireworks display. The cabin vibrated with each dodged blast, prompting Emmett to close his eyes in a feeble attempt to hold down the contents of his stomach. How much ammo does this guy have? He won't have any pretty soon. The astronaut remained focused, eyes locked on his target. The moment there came a break in the onslaught, he seized his chance and centered the plane in his crosshairs, firing off a burst of laser fire in retaliation. His aim was far more accurate than the avian felon, and he hit his enemy's engine on the first try. The oversized bird lost altitude in an instant, to which the spaceman snarked at his burning tail feathers. Anyone up for roast duck? Apparently Central Park was, for that was where the Malyard ultimately came to land, or more like a crash if the whine of the damaged engine was any clue. With the smoke trail to follow, it was easy enough for the master builders to circle around and touch down safely in the grass, jumping out and racing to the nearby scene. Benny wasn't even given a chance to think over the consequences of shooting down their foes, though thankfully it appeared the plane skimmed the ground, the only damage being a few downed trees. As the four came jogging up to the large duck, the first thing they spotted was the Penguin, still at his post by the bottom hatch, but judging by all the moaning and groaning he was doing laying on the ground, he was pretty certain he wasn't getting up anytime soon. Poison Ivy and Scarecrow fared only a tiny bit better. Arm in arm, they staggered out of the smoking bird, the former of which fixed the builders with a deadly glower, clearly frazzled by their bumpy ride. I don't know how you outgrew your pot, but I don't want to snip weeds a second time. Lucy motioned toward Emmett. Let's just say I gave him some real tender loving care. The evil botanist didn't take kindly to being upstaged in the romance department. Gritting her teeth, she shouted, "Get rid of these garden pests." One had to wonder who she was talking to, until she reached in a pocket and threw down a handful of seeds right by Lucy's feet. The bulbs dove underground on their own accord, causing the earth to rumble as their vines burst loose and spread like a virus. The Not DJ made a move to dive for cover, but it was too late. Within seconds, a cascade of monstrous Venus flytraps erupted from the soil, ensnaring and coiling around her akin to a boa constrictor. She cried out in surprise. "What the?" Benny ran to the rescue of his friend on pure instinct, never thinking that the vines would claim him as well. They just as easily hoisted him into the air, trying to squeeze the life out of him. His struggles only seemed to tighten their grip, and he sorely regretted not bringing along any weed killer. "Why don't you leave them alone?" Even while being choked upside down, the action girl and the astronaut turned their heads at the voice, catching sight of what appeared to be a giant robot. The strange contraption was of a similar make to the battling weapon the construction worker assembled to combat Lord Business's micromanagers, the only difference being its semi-smaller size. Such a resemblance made sense, considering the special was in the driver's seat, determined to save his friends. Such motivation is what gave him the extra speed to build his monstrosity out of the cars parked nearby. Hopefully the owners wouldn't be too mad at him. The clamps for hands made short work of the plants. With a few quick snips, his friends were set free, who untangled themselves while running for safety at the same time. But the special was only getting started. He tore through the deadly flora like cardboard, relishing in the rush of delivering payback for what Poison Ivy did to him and consequently made him do to his companions. The femme fatale, upon seeing her creations being destroyed, lost all patience and threw her entire bag of seeds at her former henchman, cursing him. Unikitty was the only one to notice, who gasped, "Emmett, look out!" Too late. Where one vine was cut down, two more took its place. In seconds, the Hydra-like Venus flytraps enveloped the robot, throwing it to the ground and keeping it there while its legs and arms were steadily crushed like tin cans. Before the construction worker even began crying for help, Benny was bouncing on his feet, wanting to rescue him but not knowing how. "We gotta do something!" Unikitty, however, had a plan. With a chilling and uncharacteristic malice, she bared her teeth in a vicious growl, fur darkening as she growled, "Now it's my turn!" Suddenly, in the span of an eye blink, the princess tripled in size, her unbridled fury unmatched, and she unleashed her well-concealed rage. With a scream that could split mountains, she pounced upon the horrific plans, clawing and slashing until she was sure that Emmett was safely free. Though her anger also caused the destruction of the robot, the Special hardly minded. He was perfectly content to stay well out of her way as the fly traps were reduced to grass shavings. Poison Ivy stood frozen in fear at this unexpected show of force, her heart hitting her stomach when the unicorn's cat's reddened eyes were turned on her. Making a move to run proved to be a huge mistake, for the princess leapt for her and circled the villain, spinning faster and faster like a furry tornado until the redhead was ironically wrapped up in her own vines from head to toe. The ancient mummies would be jealous. Thankfully, the princess knew when enough was enough. She managed to calm herself down just as Emmett was shouting, "Did we get 'em all?" Almost. Lucy glanced around, eyes locking onto the one criminal remaining. The Scarecrow stiffened at the sight of the Master Builders all turning towards him and advancing at a slow but steady pace. Both parties knew he was surrounded and stood little chance at escaping, but despite his knees shaking, he put on a defiant face as he whipped out a tiny burlap bag from his belt. You may have beaten us now, but I fear I have to leave you, but here's a little parting gift." With that, he emptied a pile of dust in his hand and blew it at his foes in the hopes they'd soon go running from their own shadows. But the Master Builders wouldn't be fooled twice. The four merely glanced at each other knowingly before they all inhaled a deep breath and blew the dust right back at him. The straw man gasped at the turnaround, but he was too slow to react. He wound up coughing on his own gas, the extra dose over-nauseating him and overloading his senses. His mistake may have cost him victory, but it proved to be more than entertaining to the Builders, who stood back and watched as the fearmonger started reacting to his own deep-seated nightmares. He shook like a leaf as he mumbled, "What the... Oh no, I forgot my homework, and I forgot my pants! Stop laughing at me! Please don't call my parents! I don't want to get a spanking!" The helpless Scarecrow then ran away, trapped in a hallucination he couldn't escape from. While his cries were pitiful, it made him more out to be a dork than anything sympathetic, all the more emphasized by the unabashed laughter of the Master Builders, who began sharing a slew of high fives between one another, celebrating their victory. "Yay!" Unikitty cheered. "We did it!" "Yeah," Emmett smiled, as if he couldn't quite believe it himself. "I guess we did, didn't we?" Lucy puffed her chest with pride. "I knew we could do it. Batman's got nothing on us." The others were willing to ignore how she left out the part about being captured and all. Instead, Benny put his hands on his hips, speaking in a dramatic voice befitting a comic book hero. "Citizens of Gotham, take heed, for when villainy strikes, 4 superheroes shall rise to the call of justice, for this is the dawn of the Batmen." Rather than applause, the not DJ coughed. Spaceman corrected himself. And Batwomen." But the action girl cleared her throat again, making the astronaut throw his arms open. What else can I say?" Lucy shook her head. "Nothing, just..." She was interrupted by another fit of hacking. "My throat just tickled is all." "Mine too." Unikitty joined in the coughing, her complexion turning slightly green. Emmett was about to comment that maybe the craziness of the night was just catching up to them, but he was stopped by a loud sneeze. Shortly afterwards, so did Benny. Apparently, criminals weren't the only thing they caught. They all glanced at one another in growing dread, speaking 2 words at the same time. Uh-oh. "Bless you," Benny mumbled. Emmett rubbed his bloodshot eyes. "Thanks." Lucy passed her boyfriend a box of tissues, which he took gratefully. How he and his friends could have fell under the weather so quickly was anyone's guess. It had only been a little over a day since the Special and Company rounded up and captured all of Gotham's escaped criminals, to which the police force was externally grateful, and hopefully the hefty imprisonment meant the Master Builders would be safe to relax for the next week, since they were currently stuck on the couch at Bruce Wayne's house, thermometers in mouths, sipping on chicken soup, tissues everywhere, and covered in blankets. So they saved the city and caught the flu as a reward. Such was the life of a superhero. Thankfully, the billionaire they had been masquerading as was nearly back to normal again. He was up and about, having to help Alfred with nursing his sick comrades back to health. Though he found the chore less than pleasing, he kept any and all whining to himself, especially when he discovered the lengths the gang had gone through to help him while he was forced to nap. Little by little, he pieced together the story from the different recaps he got from each of the builders. By the tale's end, he was both amused and impressed by their efforts to combat crime, and he smiled and assured them they could all crash at his house until they were well again. "Kinda feel bad," he shrugged, "since I gave you all my cold." Unikitty was positively green all over, yet waved off his concern.
It's okay. I'll have to get GCBC to bring us some rainbow tea later.
Emmett was looking forward to that, yet he furrowed his eyebrows as he thought aloud. Kinda weird, though. We never did find out what the bad guys wanted with all that stuff. "I'll have to investigate it later," Bruce rubbed his chin. "But as long as you got everything back, that's good enough for now." The construction worker nodded, then sighed. "One thing's for sure. I think we've all learned there can only be one Batman." He pointed at the billionaire. "And that's you." "Darn right," the real Cape Crusader folded his arms, hoping no other copycats were going to compete for the title of best superhero, at least not for a while. Nevertheless, proper necessities were in order, to which Bruce rubbed the back of his head, speaking in a grateful tone he rarely let anyone hear. "And, thanks for all your help. If anyone else had to be Batman, I'm glad it was you guys." Surprised to hear such nice sentiments from him, the foursome smirked and gave a curt nod, happy that he didn't mind them taking up his mantle for a night. The events of said evening made Emmett also remember something important. He turned to Lucy. "So, anyway, about what you said back there, The not DJ blushed, knowing he was referring to a certain set of words she spoke back at the warehouse. "Oh yeah, that, well, Since her sore throat couldn't form the proper words presently, her boyfriend finished for her. "I didn't know you felt the same way." It took a second for the action girl to fully process what he just said, as well as implied. She told herself it was just her fever making her overheated and flushed on the face as her eyes widened at the construction worker, who stared back with an anxious but hopeful gaze in his eyes. And then she smiled, leaned over, and planted a tender kiss on his cheek. Even with barely a voice left, Unikitty managed out a "Yay!" Benny clapped for the duo's never-ending tango, finally reaching a climax. Well, it's about time. The couple simply giggled at having given their true feelings an official announcement. Lucy sealed the deal by leaning into the special, using him as a pillow as he settled into rest. Emmett, in turn, put his arm around her, prepared to sit out his cold by cuddling with the most amazing girlfriend a guy could have. He nearly forgot Bruce was in the room, until his gaze fell on the billionaire, who stared at the duo with a sidelong glance that was difficult to get a read on. Was it longing? A daydream of what could have been? Or worse, jealousy? If it was any of those things, it didn't last long. He smirked and gave his friend a solid and approving nod. It was only right that Lucy receive the best. Any lingering awkwardness was broken when two new people entered the living room. Judging by their similar Dark Knight-inspired costumes, it was clear they were also part of the Bat family. Only the not DJ identified them right away and refrained from rolling her eyes. Of course Robin and Batgirl would choose now to show up. The boy wonder took in the scene of everyone laid up and asked, "Did we miss anything?" Bruce flashed him a deadpan eye. "If you mean the story of how these four rookies saved the city, then yeah, you're kinda late." "Darn, you'll have to fill us in later." Batgirl let out a whistle, then waved in lieu of a handshake. "We just wanted to thank you for all your help. Robin and I were stretched pretty thin. It was nice having 4 Batmen for backup." Lucy was too ill to harbor any frustration. She shrugged. "No biggie." The young detective tilted her head hopefully. "You know, Robin and I haven't really had a proper vacation in a long time. We were thinking of going away to Fabuland for a week." She leaned in with a smile. "Think you guys would be able to cover for us again?" She nearly meant the question as an innocent joke, but after a long pause of the foursome staring at the superheroes in sheer horror, they all groaned and fainted as if the mere suggestion physically hurt them. Thanked the man upstairs for Alfred, who walked in at that moment, a tray with a kettle and cups in hand. Emmett eyed the silverware and asked, "Is that the tea with the bat sleeping pills in it?" Thrown by the question, all the butler could stammer was, yes. The special grabbed a steaming cup, downed it in one gulp, then turned over, throwing the blanket over his head. "See you all in 10 hours. Bruce looked ready to burst out laughing. Alfred shook his head. The builders all glared at the construction worker as if betrayed, and Batgirl turned to Robin with a perplexed raised eyebrow. "Was it something I said?"